basically every time people ask me who are the writers that I admire, I will always start with Xixi. She's a personal hero of mine, and I like to think that she's a good friend. I have the incredible privilege of knowing her in person these few years, but way before I met her and became her friend, I had been admiring her work from a distance ever since I started learning about this thing called literature. When I was a student in the Chinese creative writing classes as an extracurricular activity in secondary school, I was introduced to her poetry, her prose, her short stories, and her novels. And every single piece of work that I've encountered that came from Xixi spoke to me in a way that transcends sort of artistic, sort of it's a sort of connection that isn't just because it's an incredible story, but that I can see that she sees the world in a similar way that I do. She sees the world in a very gentle way. She focuses on the little details in everyday life and the goodness and kindness in a lot of it, without ignoring a lot of the suffering or the inevitable pains that we as human beings may share as we go through our lives. And it gives me a lot of inspiration and a sense of companionship that there is this great writer living in the same city that I am, who has been writing for her entire life and telling stories that still speaks to me. And I have the amazing opportunity of meeting her and becoming her friend these few years. And I've also been very fortunate to be able to present her works in various ways, including helping edit one of the special issues in Fleur de Lettres or Zifa, a local literary magazine, with a special issue dedicated to Xixi last year. And I've also adapted two of Xixi's famous short stories, A Girl Like Me and The Cold, into a Cantonese language chamber opera. So that was a very innovative way of going about, both in terms of chamber opera and taking Hong Kong literature from the form of written text to a different genre of art. So both personally as a reader and as a creative person and as an editor, I find her work to be incredibly, incredibly inspiring, and that I really, really couldn't imagine what kind of person I would be if I haven't met this great person and have been introduced to her work. Okay, the other writer that I have always found very inspiring to me is the late and great Lau Yicheng. As a person who primarily writes short stories and fiction, his dedication to writing, both in terms of writing a lot of works very quickly so that we get to see a lot of different styles from him, and his obsession with creating new forms and new ways of telling stories. Both of these things are very inspiring to me and influential to my own personal writing style. So I was also introduced to his works when I was in secondary school doing creative writing after class. And I remember him saying in an interview that you have to try something new every time. It might not be perfect every time, but you have to try and do something new. And that is a sort of mantra that I've given myself when I first started writing, short stories particularly. I had to produce one short story every week for the newspaper when I was 17 years old. So it took a lot of work to try and come up with new ways to tell stories when you have to produce works so quickly and so consistently for over a year. But Lau Yicheng used to write in newspaper columns as well. He's very famous for being able to write so many stories at the same time. Some he would characterize as something that is just for perhaps a more lowbrow audience. I will put that in quotes. but some he would be writing for his own artistic pursuits and pleasure. And I find his tenacity in writing and his ability to produce a huge amount of good works quickly and innovatively to be very inspiring. So I have always tried to follow in that direction in challenging myself to find new ways to write short stories and pay a lot of attention to the form and language of short stories and how they actually play into the theme of the short stories so that the form also helps to tell the story. So Lau Yicheng would definitely be on the list of writers that I really like from Hong Kong. Last but not least, another writer that I really, really admire would be Ya-Si, who also passed away recently. I had the opportunity of meeting him when I started becoming interested in creative writing. When I was a teenager, I would go around the city with some of my friends who also share the same passion to attend a lot of sharing sessions and public speeches given by local writers. And a lot of times after that, we would go and have tea in a restaurant nearby. And for some reason, I seemed to keep running into Ya-Si, and he had been very kind and very encouraging to young people. And I'm sure a lot of writers and students in Hong Kong who have had the pleasure of meeting him would agree that he is a very warm presence, and he is not shy in showing his support for people that he thinks has sort of talent in creative writing. And I've always admired Ya-Si's poetry, although I rarely or almost never write poetry. Ya-Si's poetry really touches me in a lot of ways. For example, he would be able to take everyday experiences and present them through a lens of knowledge, through intertextuality and through speaking to cultures outside of Hong Kong, or speaking to moments in history or in art or in film. The sort of idea that he had with using literature as a way to communicate with other art forms and with other people is something that I find fascinating and very important to me as well. So when I was 20 years old, I published my first book, and at that time I was invited to an interview with a journalist in a cafe. And I didn't know that Ya-Si would actually be in the same cafe at the same time as he was being interviewed by the same newspaper. So when I arrived at the cafe, Ya-Si greeted me very kindly, and the journalist recognized that we knew each other. So she invited Ya-Si to comment on my works, and I was very nervous because I was almost a nobody who had just published her first book as a 20-year-old person who was still very, very nervous about whether I actually have what it takes to be a good writer, or whether the book that I had just published is actually up to par when I know that there's so many great writers already with the brilliant books that had inspired me so much, and I was just a newcomer to this sort of scene. But in the cafe, Ya-Si was so kind and generous with his words that he praised my works and said that he was very pleasantly surprised that such a young person was able to produce stories that were so interesting. And that is a sort of anecdote in demonstrating how I see Ya-Si as a writer from Hong Kong who sort of paved the way in a lot of things and was not shy in giving out compliments and encouraging the younger generation to pursue their passions in creative writing. I think that, combined with the admiration I already had for his poetry and his other forms of writing, there's a special place in my heart for Ya-Si, definitely.
喺咁多香港作家裏面，我比較喜歡嘅第一個就係Ya-Si梁秉鈞老師。我覺得佢嘅作品係最 令我感受最深刻嘅地方呢，佢話俾我聽係點樣用自己嘅眼光去睇個世界。佢特別喺我成長嘅時候，我講緊係中學階段70-80年代嘅時候咧，我讀佢嘅作品咧，感覺係真係一個香港嘅作家寫緊香港嘅社會，用香港一個好獨特嘅一個角度咧去睇一啲身邊好少嘅事情，係呢個係一個令我最深刻嘅地方咯。佢話俾我聽，你要用自己嘅眼光去睇個世界，去建立你自己嘅價值觀，去思考你同周圍嘅人之間嘅關係。呢個係佢最獨特嘅地方。第二個我比較喜歡嘅香港作家就係劉以鬯。劉以鬯又好有趣，我覺得佢喺上海嘅時候已經係從事文學嘅活動。咁到咗係共產黨喺大陸建立政權之後，佢嚟咗香港。咁喺中間有一段時間，佢亦都喺南洋嗰邊咧係從事個文學嘅活動。咁佢俾我一個嘅印象就係咧，佢好能夠係喺唔同嘅文化之間咧揾一個位置去發掘一啲可能係其他人係唔在意嘅一啲地方。咁我覺得係一個好難得嘅地方。第三個作家，我覺得係我比較欣賞嘅香港作家裏面就係董啟章。董啟章，我覺得佢嘅長處係佢係勤於思考、注意細節，同埋佢有一種堅持，態度好認真。呢啲咁嘅特色咧，喺佢嘅小説作品裏邊咧，係亦都好明顯咁樣表達出嚟。咁我覺得係咯，也斯、劉以鬯、董啟章呢幾位作家，我係比較喜歡嘅啦。
Well, first of all, it's Cici Saisai. She influenced me a lot. Her works, I would, if I am to use a word to describe my feeling of her work, I would say she's a very innovative writer. She explores on different literary forms, different ways of expression, different ways of writing fiction and essays and poetry. And so I would say she is the most innovative writer in Hong Kong literature. The second one I admire is P.K. Leung Ping Kwan. He's a very important poet, as well as a novelist, as well as a scholar on Hong Kong culture and Hong Kong literature. And I will describe him as very intellectual and reflective. Yeah. So by reading his works, I have many ideas and many stimulations on thinking about and reflecting on Hong Kong's cultural identity, Hong Kong's historical identity, things like that. So for me, he's an intellectual writer. And the third one, whom I admire, I would say Wong Bik Wan. She's very different from Cici and P.K. Leung. I would describe her as being a very intense writer with a very strong passion. And although her style is very different from mine, and I'm not directly influenced by her in this aspect, but I yeah, I admire her as well because she's so different from me. She has something that I do not have. I'm much closer to PK Leung and CC, you know. I also want to explore in literary forms, and I am very often described as a very intellectual writer, but you know, I'm very different from Wong Pik Wen. But she is great, yeah. And I feel the intensity, this passion that we seldom see in Hong Kong literature. You know, Hong Kong literature as a whole seems to be calmer. You know, you do not have much passion, very expressive passion, and Wong Pik Wen has this very special characteristic.
我最欣賞嘅3位香港作家，第一位就係黃碧雲女士啦，跟住會係西西女士啦，跟住亦都會係小思老師盧偉聯教授。咁點解會好欣賞黃碧雲呢？係佢有一種每一次嘅創作，佢都係以一個新嘅獨立嘅調查嘅精神去做嘅創作。我覺得呢一種精神呢係比較少喺香港嘅作家入邊會見到，可能之後都會傾到，即係喺香港寫作遇到嘅問題。咁但係佢多年嚟嘅創作，佢都會係以一個可以話係 project base 啦嘅一個嘅形態去做佢嘅創作嘅。咁包括係即係近年嘅盧棋之死啦，或者再之前嘅譬如由呢一個口述歷史去即係再 develop 出嚟嘅烈女圖啊等等啦。咁其實佢去透過去同好多唔同人嘅接觸去傾談，去發展佢自己豐富自己嘅語言。咁我覺得呢一種精神係好難得嘅。咁當然亦都有好多嘅評論者會講到佢嘅寫作嘅題材啦，去關心香港後殖民嘅狀態啦。佢會好關心即係尤其是香港由早年嘅時候，即係面對咗97啲人離散走咗之後再翻嚟嘅嗰種好浮動嘅狀態啦咁樣。咁呢啲嘅作品其實都係好相當反映時代。但係我最欣賞嘅，除咗係佢寫嘅題材同埋方法之外，亦都係佢嗰種努力不懈嘅創作精神。係咁樣講好似好浮泛，但係其實嗰個重點係佢喺呢一種嘅精神入邊，佢係有創新嘅，即係佢係獨立地覺得每一個作品都係一個新嘅試驗。我覺得呢一種嘅新嘅嘗試嘅試驗探索係當然好多作家都會講，但係唔係每一個作家都做得到。咁西西亦都係好我欣賞嘅作者，因為即係我即係同佢嘅接觸啊傾談，佢係一個好自然而然會寫作嘅一個人，即係寫作已經成為咗佢生活嘅一部分。同埋我好欣賞佢探索世界同埋對世界好奇嘅嗰種嘅好奇心，即係佢對佢好有興趣嘅嘢，佢就會好着迷咁樣去了解啦、研究啦，並且係去寫出一個即係去寫佢關於佢嘅嘢，又或者係構作一個長篇作品出嚟。咁所以其實即係西西亦都係喺香港入邊一個好難能可貴嘅作家嘅形態嚟嘅，即係喺呢一個嘅社會入邊有一個空間可以俾到呢一類型嘅人啦，或者作者啦，佢去不斷咁樣去寫作、去出版咁樣。咁其實係一啲都唔容易嘅事嚟嘅。咁亦都加上佢嘅性格係好堅持去創作啦咁樣。咁但係有趣嘅係咧，頭先講到佢好堅持，但係事實上咧，佢亦都有一種好即係以寫作為遊戲嘅心態嘅，即係佢唔係話我一定要做個 勁嘅作家，我一定要係即係嗰個作品去流傳後世啦。咁樣佢唔係以呢種心態去創作嘅，即係佢真係一種寫作係遊戲啊，寫作係佢生活嘅一部分啊。佢好想即係去有一啲新嘅嘗試啊，同樣係喺個作品上面。咁所以我覺得係佢係好呢種精神，亦都唔容易喺香港嗰度揾到嘅。咁所以係我都好欣賞嘅一個作家。第三位就係小思老師啦。咁其實係佢嘅研究咧，佢對香港文學嘅貢獻咧，係即係睇嚟即係都不用我多說。咁佢嗰個嘅即係佢嗰種精神，佢亦都其實係讓我哋去重新去思考香港文學係一啲乜嘢。尤其是係佢保留咗好多以前嘅作家嘅資料啦、舊嘅剪報啦，將佢去修整啦。但係佢同時亦都曾經講過，就係佢覺得佢嗰陣時嘅修整，佢未必係最適合寫文學史啦，因為佢需要一個可能更加長、更加闊嘅一個梳理啦。咁呢一種研究者探索者精神同埋資料搜集嘅嗰種嘅細緻嘅程度，對於歷史嘅文件嘅嗰種珍視嘅程度，其實係我亦都係好欣賞嘅。
好，咁第一位呢，就係馬朗嚇。咁馬朗呢係喺50年代初嗰時候呢嚟到香港嘅。咁佢係1955年呢就創辦咗一本對於香港文學史非常之重要嘅文學刊物，就叫做《文藝新潮》啊。咁佢喺《文藝新潮》呢本刊物嗰度呢，就即係組織譯介大量嘅西方現代主義文學嘅作品嚇。咁佢呢部分嘅文學工作呢，就即係啟發咗一代嘅香港作家嘅嚇。咁我覺得呢本文學雜誌呢，至今為止都係香港文學史上邊最重要嘅一本文學雜誌嚇。咁所以馬朗呢，一直都係我心入邊嘅一個榜樣，係我學習嘅對象嚇。咁第二位呢，就係劉以鬯先生嚇。咁劉以鬯先生呢，喺我認識嘅同埋見過嘅作家入邊呢，應該係最勤奮嘅一位作家嚇。咁樣喺我哋好難想像，即係好似喺70年代嗰啲時候呢，咁佢都係日寫萬字咁樣去淨係靠寫作去維生。因為依家其實都幾難想像話你淨係靠寫作去維生，即係你唔做任何其他嘅工作咁樣。咁但係劉以鬯先生佢又真係做到，咁而且佢係做到呢一點之外呢，佢仲有時間咧去寫出一啲文學價值非常之高嘅文學作品，例如話酒徒啊、對倒啊、自內啊等等嘅小説嚇。咁另一方面咧，就係1980年代佢都成為一本文學雜誌叫《香港文學》嘅主編。咁佢喺做主編嘅呢一個階段入邊咧，其實咧就係俾咗好多機會俾年輕嘅香港作家，咁都間接地咧去培養咗新一代嘅香港作家。所以我覺得咧，佢都係我一個喺編輯上邊咧應該要學習嘅榜樣嚇。咁仲有一位咧就係梁秉鈞，亦即係也斯嚇。佢令我非常之佩服嘅一點就係佢喺1970年代嗰時候咧就提出咗即係生活化呢一個詩歌概念。咁樣其實呢一種詩歌呢個詩歌概念要擺喺1970年代呢個歷史脈絡入邊去理解嘅啊。佢依靠生活化呢一個概念咧，咁樣同埋佢同埋佢一啲寫詩嘅好朋友喺當時都係比較年輕嘅一班朋友啊，係嘛？咁樣就佢依靠呢一個概念咧，即係擺脫咗台灣自1950年代以嚟嗰種超現實主義對於香港詩歌嘅影響。咁另一方面咧，佢都擺脫咗係當時中國大陸嗰種社會主義現實主義文學嘅影響，係嘛？咁樣仲另外仲喺1970年代 即係抵抗咗即係余光中先生嚟到嚟香港帶嚟嘅嗰種新古典嘅詩風係嘛？咁所以咧佢嗰種生活化嘅嗰種寫作咧，即係為當時嘅一啲部分啦嚇嘅年輕嘅香港詩人同埋作家咧，能夠以佢哋嘅嗰個角度。以佢哋自己最舒服、最自然嘅語言咧，去書寫自己長大嘅地方同埋經驗，而使佢哋可以為香港詩歌咧磋商出一個文化身份出嚟。所以呢一點咧係我非常之佩服也斯嘅地方。而且佢呢個所謂嘅生活化呢個影響係非常之長遠嘅。咁樣甚至到依家咧，我哋都仲可以感受到佢呢一種寫作風格對我哋現在仲喺度喺香港寫詩嘅人嘅影響嚇。所以即係也斯咧，都係我一個非常之佩服嘅一位詩人嚇。
I would say my first choice will be C.C. 西西。When I first read her work, I didn't like it. It was an essay that I had to read in secondary school, so it's a textbook passage. But after I actually get to know her work more, I find it absolutely amazing with the variety of things that she has written and has kept on writing all these years. She always strikes me as someone with a very active imagination, but yet the message or even the story in itself is still very much grounded in our everyday life, very much relevant to everyone. So that's Sai. The second, I think, maybe somewhat not an obvious choice for others, but I would say is Lü Qizhi Lucacy. She's I translated one of her short stories into English for renditions. Was one of my first lengthy translation, I would say, and I got to read everything she's written, everything she's published over the years. She's she actually came from Hong Kong, but she has migrated to France for many years and has lived her life there now. I find her work very much it has a very strong local Hong Kong flavor, even when she's been living overseas for so many years. And yet there are also stories not based in Hong Kong, but based in different parts of the world, based in maybe France, somewhere in Europe. So there's a great variety, of things, especially her short stories and essays. I loved all of them. And the third one, I suppose it might be Gu Changwu. Gu Chang, he's a poet and Hong Kong poet and essay writer. And I also translated a couple of his essays and short poems into English some years ago. And I got to know the guy. I know him when I was in Hong Kong U studying for my master's degree. He was doing his PhD there, so we got in touch with each other. And then I was his assistant, along with another supervisor of mine, and we was working on a Kunqiu project, the Kun opera. project, and we translated some of the literary works or theoretical work on Kunqi's singing. And so one of his work that I particularly like is a very small volume called 祖父的大宅, 祖父的大宅. It consists of a whole bunch of very short essays or anecdotes with his memories of his hometown, his old family, relatives, and so on, and how his life was there in southern China, how he grew up in the 40s and 50s. Yes, that's three I can think of offhand, I would say.